He was born with the most dangerous last name in America. While his father ruled Chicago with blood and fear, his son spent a lifetime trying to disappear. This is not a story about Al Capone. This is the story of the boy who buried him, without ever firing a shot. If you love real stories about power, legacy, and the ghosts that history forgets, subscribe now, because this one will change how you see the most feared name in America. Brooklyn, New York, December 4th, 1918. A baby cries in a small apartment. His mother, May Josephine Coughlin, holds him close. His father stands in the doorway, smelling of cigar smoke and whiskey. The father is Alphonse Capone. The baby is Albert Francis Capone. Reporters will later call him Sonny. In that room, the name feels simple. Outside, it will never be simple again. May marries Al within weeks to quiet talk and secure the record. She's 19, steady and private. He is rising fast under Johnny Torrio. At home, he is gentle with the child. On the street, he is the most ambitious man in the neighborhood. From the start, there are health problems. The boy suffers painful ear infections. Doctors come and go with compresses and powders. Family accounts in later years suggest the father's untreated disease may have passed damage that doctors of the time could not see. No medical record survives to prove it. What is certain is the pain. Nights stretch long while May sits by the bed and listens to small sounds of hurt behind the boy's left ear. Prohibition begins in 1920 and turns small hustlers into large operators. The Capones moved to Chicago, first to the South Side, then to a brick house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue. It looks ordinary from the street. Inside, drivers and guards wait by the phones. The neighborhood knows who lives there. Mothers pull children indoors when dark sedans idle at the curb. May tries to build a normal home. She keeps the piano busy, lowers voices, and teaches her son never to speak about his father's work. Al loves the boy and repeats one promise. This kid is going to be a gentleman. He is not going into the racket. The infections get worse. By age 7, the swelling threatens the bone. A specialist warns that the infection could reach the brain. There is one option, a mastoidectomy. It is dangerous in the 1920s. Al says yes at once. Money is not a problem. In a New York operating room, surgeons open the bone behind the ear and scrape away the diseased tissue. The boy survives. The price is permanent. Hearing in the left ear is gone. From then on, Sonny lives in half sound. He learns to sit close to a speaker. He learns to watch faces before words. In the Capone house, where phones ring at every hour and men whisper on the stairs, quiet becomes a skill and a shelter. Chicago changes Al from ambitious lieutenant to absolute boss. Reporters call him Scarface and the Big Fellow. Politicians come to lunch. His income rivals small corporations. None of that buys peace for a child. May sends Sonny to Catholic school under priests who keep order and mind their tone. Teachers remember a polite boy who sits in the front row so he can hear. He writes neatly, keeps to himself, and leaves quickly when the bell rings. When asked what his father does, he says, he is in business. Outside the classroom, the city grows violent. Prohibition money breeds wars. Trucks get hijacked. Shots find cars at stoplights. In February 1929, 7 men die in a North Side garage. The St. Valentine's Day massacre becomes a national headline, and the name Capone becomes the shorthand for the city itself. Cameramen wait outside South Prairie Avenue. Flashbulbs pop against the drapes. An armed driver takes the boy to school. Classmates whisper. Some try to stand near him. Others call him the gangster's son. May chooses distance. The family spends longer stretches at the White House on Palm Island in Miami Beach. It is meant to be a retreat, and it works like a fortress. The stucco glows in the sun, but life inside is small and careful. Then comes 1931. Federal agents indict Al Capone for tax evasion. The trial becomes theater. Courtrooms overflow. The sentence is 11 years. Sonny is 12 when he watches his father led away in handcuffs. The house grows quiet. Guards leave. Phones stop ringing. The empire ends in a week. May and her son stay in Florida. He studies with tutors. and walks the edge of Biscayne Bay where nobody knows his face. He turns his good ear toward the wind and listens to water and birds. Some afternoons he imagines a life where the last name is ordinary. Visits to his father are rare. Al writes short notes from prison. Be polite, study hard. By the late 1930s, disease has broken the man who once ran Chicago. Neurosyphilis erodes his mind. He loses names and signatures. In 1939, he is released to Florida care. Sonny is 21 when they meet again in the garden. The father shuffles, looks up, and calls him by the wrong name. The son sets a chair in the sun and answers softly. He does not correct him. The boy who grew up inside noise now understands the full weight of silence. The first era is over. The criminal machine is gone. May guards the money that remains and protects her son's path. Sonny chooses restraint. He registers at the University of Miami as Albert F. Capone. He studies business. He keeps his head down. Instructors remember discipline and modest conduct. The hearing loss becomes part of his calm. He listens more than he speaks. He gives short answers and never mentions home. By the early 1940s, he is a young man whose habits do not match his last name. Books instead of gossip. A jacket and tie instead of silk and diamonds. He builds the outline of a normal life, the one his father once claimed he wanted for him. The old world still knocks. Reporters call the house and leave questions at the door. He ignores them. May opens a small restaurant years later and pays every tax. Sonny helps behind the scenes without posing for a picture. The Capone name appears on a clean ledger for the first time. The lesson is simple. Loud power ends badly. Quiet work endures. That is where we leave him at the end of this first chapter. A young man with half his hearing, a famous name he will not use, and a plan to live as if history can be rewritten by patience. By the early 1940s, Sonny Capone was a man determined to erase history. While America was marching toward war, he was fighting a quieter battle at home, the fight to live as an ordinary person under an extraordinary name. In college, he kept to himself, rarely joining events or clubs. Teachers described him as polite, steady, and distant, the kind of student who listened carefully and spoke only when necessary. He never mentioned Chicago, never referred to his father, and when people asked, he simply said his family was from Florida. To his classmates, he was just Albert. But outside the classroom, the world was changing fast. Al Capone's empire had collapsed, and yet his name still echoed through America. Movies, radio shows, and pulp novels painted him as both a monster and a legend. For Sonny, that fame was poison. He understood that every headline, every retelling of his father's crimes, made his own life harder to live. During those years in Miami, Sonny met a girl named Diana Ruth Casey. She was bright, kind, and warm in a way that disarmed him. She came from a good family, far removed from crime or scandal. Their friendship began quietly, two people who shared classes, church gatherings, and occasional walks along the beach. Diana had no interest in his past, and never asked about his father. For Sonny, that silence was everything. It was the first time in his life he could simply be himself. As the months passed, they grew close. Sonny was reserved, but Diana's calm nature pulled him out of his shell. He would listen to her talk about her dreams, her family, and her plans for the future, and he began to imagine a life that wasn't built on fear or legacy. When he finally asked her to marry him, it wasn't in a restaurant or a fancy setting. It was a simple evening on the porch of her parents' house. No speeches, no ring of diamonds, just a quiet promise. On December 30th, 1941, they were married at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Miami Beach. Nearly 300 guests filled the pews. Reporters caught wind of it, and for a moment the cameras returned. Headlines read, "The son of America's most infamous gangster marries his high school sweetheart." Al and May attended the ceremony separately, keeping their distance to avoid a scene. Al, already sick and slow, sat quietly in the back. He smiled when the vows were said, his face worn but proud. It was the last time father and son would ever share a public moment. Just 6 years later, in 1947, Al Capone died at the Palm Island home. He was 48 years old. Sonny was 28 when he stood by the grave beside his mother. The world's photographers tried to capture the image, but Sonny turned away. There were no tears in public, no speeches, only a brief nod and silence. When the ceremony ended, he walked back to the car, sat beside his mother, and said softly, "It's over." That day marked the true beginning of his life. For the first time, he was free to choose what kind of man he wanted to be. He and Diana built their own life in Miami, close enough for May to visit, but far enough to escape the shadows of Palm Island. Their home was modest, 2 bedrooms, a small garden, a quiet street. To their neighbors, they were simply Mr. and Mrs. Capone, a polite couple who never discussed their past. Sonny worked a series of jobs, most of them simple and honest. For a time, he handled accounts for a local business. Later, he took a position with the city as a probation officer, a small irony that he never mentioned. The man whose father built an empire of crime now worked to help others stay within the law. His co-workers knew him as reliable, quiet, and careful with his words. He never raised his voice. May, still strong and protective, encouraged him to keep life small and steady. In 1956, she decided to open a restaurant, an Italian eatery on Miami Beach called Ted's Grotto. She wanted to create something clean, something good to balance the past. The restaurant was small but charming, serving homemade pasta and meatballs. Patrons remembered it as a cozy place with a friendly owner who greeted guests with warmth. Few realized the woman behind the counter was Al Capone's widow. Sonny helped behind the scenes, doing the books and supplies, but never appeared in photographs or advertisements. For the first time, the Capone name stood for something honest. The restaurant paid every tax, closed on time, and never had police outside its doors. For May, it was redemption. For Sonny, it was peace. And in those quiet years, he and Diana raised 4 daughters: Veronica, Teresa, Barbara, and Patricia. The girls grew up in a home filled with love and rules. Every night before bed, Sonny reminded them of one thing: never speak about your grandfather. The girls attended Catholic school, took piano lessons, and played outside like ordinary children. Their last name carried a story they would never tell. To their teachers and neighbors, they were the Brown family, polite, private, and ordinary. Inside the home, there were no pictures of Al Capone, no newspaper clippings, no trace of the empire that had once shaken America. May visited often, still careful and soft-spoken. She cooked Sunday dinners, combed her granddaughter's hair, and reminded them to pray. She spoke little about the past. In her presence, the old world felt distant, fading into memory. Sonny's daughters grew up learning that anonymity was not shame, but safety. They learned that quiet was not weakness, but wisdom. As the years passed, Sonny watched the world move on. Hollywood rediscovered his father, turning the old crimes into entertainment. Gangsters became movie stars, their lives rewritten into myths. For the Capone family, every new movie was another wound reopened. Reporters occasionally tracked Sonny down, hoping for a quote. He refused every time. He changed phone numbers, moved houses, and never answered letters. He wanted no part in the legend. Then, in 1965, his name appeared in the papers again, not for violence or scandal, but for a simple mistake. A Miami drugstore clerk accused him of stealing 2 bottles of aspirin and a pack of batteries worth $3.50. The case was trivial, but the name made it news. Editors printed it in bold letters: Capone's son in minor theft. The story spread across the country. Sonny pleaded no contest and received probation. When the judge asked him why a man of means would steal, he reportedly shrugged and said, "Everybody has a little larceny in them." Whether he truly said it or not, the line became famous. For Sonny, it was humiliating. He had spent decades rebuilding his name, and now one careless headline brought the past roaring back. He completed probation quietly and returned home, where Diana scolded him for weeks. The press moved on, but the lesson stayed. He realized that as long as the name Capone appeared beside his own, peace would always be temporary. A year later, he filed to have his name legally changed. He would no longer be Albert Francis Capone. He would become Albert Francis Brown. The court approved the change without objection. From that day forward, every record, every account, every phone listing carried his new name. To the world, Capone's bloodline vanished. In its place lived a man named Brown, quiet, middle-aged, and finally free from the shadow of a name that had never belonged to him by choice. By the late 1960s, Albert Francis Brown, the man once known as Sonny Capone, had learned to live in the quiet corners of America. He had changed his name, moved houses, and built a life designed to disappear. But even the most careful man cannot fully escape the shadow of a legend. In the summer of 1968, that shadow found him again. The country was burning with unrest. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. The Vietnam War divided the nation, and fear of political violence filled the air. In the middle of that chaos, the FBI received a tip that a man named Sonny Capone had made a threatening phone call about Senator Ted Kennedy from a payphone in Coral Gables, Florida. The Bureau took it seriously. Within hours, agents began checking every record, every address, and every phone number that could connect to the Capone name. When they arrived at Albert Brown's modest home, they found a middle-aged man with neat hair, soft voice, and no history of violence. He was polite, calm, and surprised to even hear his old name spoken aloud. The agents questioned him for hours. He answered everything carefully, with patience but no fear. In the end, they realized the absurdity of it. There was no evidence, no motive, no connection. The case was dropped within weeks, but for Albert, the damage was done. That single event reminded him that no matter how quiet his life became, the world would always remember the name he was trying to forget. After the investigation ended, he became even more cautious. He refused all interviews, avoided public events, and ignored every letter from writers who wanted him to share his story. When new films about his father appeared, he turned off the television. He told his daughters never to respond if anyone asked about the family name. The Browns became ghosts in plain sight. They moved often within Florida, leaving behind little paper trail. Each new neighborhood saw them as a friendly but private family. Neighbors remembered a tall man who waved from the porch, mowed his own lawn, and always said hello, but never much more. His voice was soft, his hearing still half gone. His eyes still carrying the weight of a lifetime spent looking over his shoulder. By the mid-1970s, America had turned the gangster past into entertainment. The movie The Godfather had made the mafia a myth. Historians wrote about Al Capone as if he were a figure from folklore. But Albert Francis Brown wanted nothing to do with it. He never wrote a memoir, never gave a statement, and never sought fame. His silence was his protection and his rebellion. To live without attention was, for him, the truest victory. He was aging now. His hair silvered early, his movements slower. He spent evenings with his family, reading the newspaper or tending to small projects around the house. His daughters were grown, starting families of their own, carrying new names that offered freedom from the past. To most people, Albert Brown was just another quiet man living a decent life in Florida. To him, that was enough. Then came 1986. May Capone, the woman who had guarded the family's dignity for half a century, passed away at the age of 89. She had outlived the men who once ruled Chicago. Her death marked the end of the original Capone line. For Albert, it was both a heartbreak and a release. He had spent decades protecting her, watching over her, and keeping her world safe from the noise of the outside world. With her gone, he was the last living member of the family who had known Al Capone not as myth, but as father. Reporters tried to find him again. A few succeeded. They found a man listed in public records as Albert F. Brown, living quietly in Florida. When they knocked, the story always ended the same way. A polite voice behind the door, no comment, then silence. Every new book or film about Al Capone reignited curiosity, and each time Albert retreated further from view. He turned down interviews from major newspapers and historians, some of whom offered large payments for even a short conversation. He refused them all. As the years went on, the life he built with Diana slowly faded. Whether from distance, time, or quiet exhaustion, The marriage ended without scandal or noise. By the late 1980s, he had left Florida behind, moving west to Northern California under his legal name, Albert Francis Brown. The choice of location was deliberate. Far from the coast that obsessed over mafia history, far from Miami where every local knew the Capone mansion, he found refuge in a small gated community called Auburn Lake Trails. In the hills of El Dorado County, the area was peaceful, surrounded by pine trees and quiet roads. Neighbors described him as polite, gentle, and reserved. He introduced himself simply as Al Brown, a retired salesman. He liked gardening, reading, and coffee on the porch. He never spoke of Chicago, never mentioned his father, and never hinted at who he really was. Only later, after his death, did some residents realize the truth about the man who lived down the street. In Auburn Lake Trails, Albert met a woman named America Francis, known to friends as Amy. No one is sure exactly when or how they met. Some say they married quietly, others believe she simply became his companion. However it began, she was as private as he was. Protective, cautious, and loyal. Together, they built a quiet rhythm of life, free from headlines, free from fear. Mornings with newspapers, afternoons tending the yard, evenings sitting side by side on the porch as the sun went down over the trees. By the time the 1990s arrived, Albert Francis Brown had lived more than 4 decades under a name the world didn't recognize. His daughters had grown and moved on, his parents were gone, and his story had faded from the public mind. He had succeeded in doing what no Capone before him ever could. He had become invisible. There were no scandals, no investigations, no unfinished business. Just a man, his garden, and the peace he had fought to earn. By the late 1990s, the world had moved on from Al Capone's empire. The gang wars, the bootlegging, the violence, they were history now, something told in movies and classrooms. But in a quiet home in Northern California, one man was still living under the shadow of that history. His name was Albert Francis Brown. Though few knew he had once been Sonny Capone, he was in his 70s now, his hair completely silver, his posture still strong. Every morning he read the local newspaper with a cup of coffee, never the national one. He tended his small garden, checked the mail, and waved to neighbors from his porch. To them, he was just Al Brown, a friendly retiree who liked his privacy. No one would have guessed that the most feared man in America had once called him son. His companion, Amy, guarded their peace like a secret. She rarely let strangers near the house. When people asked about their past, she changed the subject. They lived simply. No servants, no photographs, no reminders. The television stayed off whenever old gangster films appeared. The newspapers were folded shut whenever someone mentioned the Capone name. The silence that surrounded Albert was not loneliness. It was choice. In the last decade of his life, he became even more of a ghost. He did not write letters. He had no public statements, no memoirs, no interviews. When journalists tried to track him down for books or documentaries, they reached dead ends. Public records listed only Albert F. Brown, retired, living quietly in El Dorado County. The Capone bloodline had faded into ordinary life, just as he had always wanted, but invisibility has its own weight. Late at night, when the hills were quiet, Albert would sit on the porch and think about the years gone by. He had watched his father rise to power, watched him fall into sickness, and watched his mother fight to protect what little remained. He had carried their secrets for a lifetime and built a wall of silence to keep the world away. Maybe, he thought, that was the real victory, to end a story of violence with peace. When his health began to fade, Amy stayed by his side. Neighbors recalled seeing her drive him to appointments, always careful, always patient. There were no headlines, no attention, no cameras, just 2 people growing old quietly together. His daughters visited when they could, bringing grandchildren who never knew the truth about the man in the garden. To them, he was Grandpa Al, a kind old man who told gentle stories about fishing and baseball. On July 8, 2004, Albert Francis Brown died peacefully in his California home. He was 85 years old. There were no reporters, no police, no cameras, just a local notice in the paper listing his name, his date of death, and his burial record. No mention of Al Capone. No mention of the bloodline that had once dominated America. For the first time in history, a Capone had left the world quietly. After his death, Amy spoke briefly to a small group of reporters who managed to find her. She said only one thing. Al Capone has been dead a long time. His son had nothing to do with him. Let him rest in peace. That single sentence became the final word on a story that had stretched nearly a century. When historians tried to reconstruct his life, they found almost nothing. No letters, no diaries, no interviews. Even the FBI files were thin. Just a few pages noting investigations closed with no further action. It was as if the man had spent his life erasing himself from history, one record at a time. And yet, in that silence, there was meaning. Because while the world still argued about Al Capone's crimes, his son had proven something the father never could. That legacy is not destiny. That you can be born into noise and still choose quiet. That you can inherit power and still choose peace. Albert Francis Capone had once been a boy living in a fortress guarded by guns. He grew into a man who lived behind no walls at all. He had watched his father lose everything to greed and pride, and he had chosen the opposite path. No fortune, no fame, no followers, just an ordinary life. He died the way his father never could. In his bed, surrounded by peace, untouched by violence and free from the name that had once ruled America. And maybe that is the greatest irony of all. Al Capone built an empire that crumbled. His son built a life that endured. The father was remembered by his crimes. The son was remembered by his silence. For 85 years, the world never really saw him. And yet, in the end, it was that invisibility that made him immortal.